The morning Edgar Talbot signed the papers to sell the Talbot Ranch. A stranger's wagon wheel cracked clean in half on the main road running through the edge of his property, and it changed every single thing that followed. Edgar had made up his mind 3 weeks prior, standing in the empty kitchen of the house his father had built board by board in 1858, looking at the peeling wallpaper, and the cracked window glass, and the dust that had settled over every surface like a thin gray quilt. His mother had been gone 6 years, his father too. The ranch hands had drifted away one by one as the money dried up and the cattle herd dwindled, and the land itself seemed to grow tired and thirsty under the relentless Wyoming sun. He was 31 years old and he was done. He was going to sell the whole operation to the Harlan Land Company out of Cheyenne, take whatever they offered him, and head west to California, maybe Seattle if his legs carried him that far. He had heard there was work up in the Pacific Northwest, good work, honest work that did not require a man to watch everything his family had built slowly crumble to nothing. The Harlan Company representative, a thin man named Curtis Feld who wore a suit too fine for Powder River County, had come out 2 days ago and left the papers for Edgar to review and sign. Edgar had sat with them all night, a glass of whiskey at his elbow that he barely touched, reading the same paragraphs over and over until the words blurred. The figure they were offering was low. He knew it was low. But it was enough to get him started somewhere new, and starting somewhere new was the only thing he had left to want. He had signed them that morning, folded them into the inside pocket of his coat, and gone out to saddle his horse to ride the 4 miles into town to file them with the land office. He had just come out of the barn, leading his roan gelding, Buck, by the reins, when he heard it. The sound of a wagon in trouble comes before you see the trouble itself. There is a particular rattling groan that wooden wheel spokes make when something has gone badly wrong, and then there is the sharp crack that sounds almost like a rifle shot, and then the terrible lurching sound of a loaded wagon dropping suddenly on one side. Edgar heard all 3 of those sounds in quick succession from the direction of the main road, followed by a woman's voice crying out in alarm, not screaming, not the sound of injury, but a sharp exclamation of someone who has just lost control of a situation and knows it immediately. He was up on Buck and moving before he had consciously decided to go. The ranch gate was 200 yards from the road, and he covered it in a little more than a minute, coming through the gate and swinging left to find the scene exactly as he had imagined it. A medium-sized covered wagon had veered off the hard-packed road into the softer gravel of the shoulder, and the rear right wheel had shattered where it met a buried rock. The wagon sat canted at a miserable angle, the canvas cover pulled tight over whatever was loaded inside. A single bay horse stood harnessed to the front of the wagon, ears flat, unhappy about the whole situation but not bolting, which meant whoever was driving knew horses well enough to have trained that one to stay calm. The driver was a woman. She had already climbed down from the seat and was standing at the broken wheel, hands on her hips, surveying the damage with an expression of controlled frustration rather than despair. She was perhaps 27 or 28, dressed practically in a dark blue traveling dress with a canvas duster coat over it that was dusty from the road. Her hair was a deep brown, the color of Good River mud after rain, pinned up under a wide-brimmed hat that had seen better days. She was not a soft woman. Edgar could see that immediately. There was something in the line of her jaw and the steadiness of her eyes as she turned to look at him that told him this was a person who had dealt with hard things before and had not been broken by them. "That is a problem," she said, looking at him without flinching, apparently not alarmed by a mounted stranger arriving at speed. "It is," Edgar agreed, pulling Buck to a stop and swinging down. "Edgar Talbot. My property starts at that gate there." "Louise Bishop," she said, extending her hand the way a man would straight out for a firm shake. He took it, a little surprised. "I appreciate you coming so quickly, Mr. Talbot. I don't suppose you know where I might find a wheelwright." "Nearest one is Henry Sparks in Millhaven, 4 miles east." Louise Bishop looked east as if she could see Millhaven from where she stood. "Could you get word to him?" "I could ride in myself," Edgar said, already looking at the wagon and the angle it sat at. "But first we ought to get this wagon level before it tips the rest of the way and ruins what you have loaded inside. What have you got in there, if you don't mind my asking?" "Everything I own," Louise said simply. "Which is not very much, but it is all I have." Something in the plainness of that statement landed in Edgar's chest in a way he did not entirely understand. He looked at her for a moment, then looked at the wagon and nodded. "There is a flat stretch of ground inside my gate, wide enough and level. If we can get your horse moving and I walk beside to balance the load, we can limp the wagon to that spot before it gets any worse. Then I'll ride for Sparks." Louise considered this for perhaps 3 seconds. She was not the kind of woman who deliberated endlessly. He would learn that later, but she also was not impulsive. She calculated quickly. "All right," she said, "let's do that." They managed it barely. The broken wheel scraped and ground against the gravel, but Edgar put his shoulder against the high side of the wagon and walked it through the gate, while Louise guided the bay horse, speaking to it in a low, steady voice that kept the animal calm through the whole grinding ordeal. By the time they got the wagon parked on the flat ground near the barn, Edgar's shirt was soaked through with effort, and his right shoulder ached from the sustained pressure of holding the wagon level. Louise thanked him without making a fuss of it, which he appreciated. Excessive gratitude made him uncomfortable. "I'll ride for Sparks," he said, wiping his face with his bandana. "It'll be 2 hours at least before he can get out here, maybe 3. You are welcome to water your horse at the trough and wait in the shade." "Thank you," Louise said. She was already walking around to look at the back of the wagon, checking on whatever was inside. "I hope I'm not delaying you from somewhere." Edgar glanced at the folded papers in the inside pocket of his coat. "Nothing that can't wait," he said. He rode into Millhaven at a canter, found Henry Sparks at his shop, explained the situation, and arranged for the wheelwright to come out that afternoon with a replacement wheel. While he was in town, he also, almost without thinking about it, stopped at the general store and bought a small paper sack of coffee beans, because the pot at the ranch house had been empty for 2 days and he had not bothered to restock it. And now he found himself thinking about having something decent to offer a guest when he returned. It was a small thing. He thought almost nothing of it at the time. When he got back to the ranch, Louise Bishop had done something he had not expected. She had found the outdoor water pump near the barn and was using it to fill not just the trough for her horse, but also the empty rain barrel near the side of the house that had sat dry since the previous autumn. She was working with the methodical efficiency of someone who spotted what needed doing and simply did it without being asked. "You do not have to do that," Edgar said, unsaddling Buck. "I know," Louise said, "but your barrel was empty and this pump works fine. Seemed wasteful not to." Edgar looked at her. "How do you know my rain barrel was meant to collect water?" "I grew up on a ranch in Colorado," she said. "Garfield County. I know what a rain barrel is for." He went inside and started the coffee and came back out to find her sitting on the flat top rail of the fence near the barn, not idly, but with her eyes moving carefully over the property, taking in the house and the fields and the distant line of fence posts that marked the eastern boundary of the Talbot land. There was something assessing about her gaze, not greedy or calculating, but the look of someone who understood land and was in the habit of reading it. Edgar brought her a cup of coffee when it was ready, and she wrapped her hands around it and thanked him with a small nod. They stood in a comfortable silence for a moment, which surprised him. Silence with strangers usually felt like something that needed to be filled. This did not. "Where are you headed?" he asked. "Millhaven," she said. "My cousin Vera wrote to me 6 months ago, said she and her husband had a boarding house there and that I could come and work it with them. It seemed like the right move at the time." Seemed. Edgar caught the past tense. Louise looked at her coffee cup. "Vera's husband passed away in February. Fever." Vera wrote again last month to say she was going to close the boarding house and go back east to her family in Ohio. The letter reached me after I had already sold everything and packed the wagon. She said it without self-pity, just as a sequence of events. So Millhaven is where I am going, but I am not entirely certain what I am going to do when I get there. Edgar was quiet for a moment. I am sorry about your cousin's husband. Thank you. He was a good man. She took a sip of coffee. This is very good, by the way. Freshly bought, Edgar admitted. Something in her eyes told him she understood he had bought it because of her presence, and something in the small smile that followed told him she found that charming rather than presumptuous. Henry Sparks arrived at 2:30 with his wagon and a new wheel. He was a stocky, efficient man who did not waste words, and he had the broken wheel off, and the new one fitted within an hour while Edgar and Louise stood nearby and talked. They talked the way people sometimes do when conversation comes easily and naturally, moving from topic to topic without forcing it. She asked him about the ranch, and he told her about it honestly, about his father building it, about the years of good cattle runs, about the slow decline since his father's illness had taken him away from the work and then taken him away from the world entirely. He did not tell her about the papers in his coat pocket. He was not sure why he withheld that particular piece of information. It was not deception exactly. He simply did not bring it up. When Sparks had finished and named his price, Louise reached into the small purse she kept on a cord at her waist. Edgar watched her count out the coins with careful fingers and felt something tighten in him when he saw how precise and deliberate she was about it. The way a person is deliberate when the money they have is exactly the money they need, and there is not much margin beyond it. "What do I owe you, Mr. Talbot?" she asked when Sparks had driven away. "Nothing," Edgar said. "I don't take charity." "It isn't charity. You filled my rain barrel." She looked at him steadily. "A rain barrel is not worth the time you spent riding into town and the space on your property and standing here while Mr. Sparks worked." "Call it good neighborly conduct, then," Edgar said. "I have not had a reason to practice it in a while. Let me have this one." Louise held his gaze for a long beat. Then the corner of her mouth moved just barely. "All right," she said. "Thank you, Mr. Talbot." She climbed up onto the wagon seat, gathered the reins, and then paused. "It was a pleasure to meet you," she said. "I hope things go well for you here." She clicked to the bay horse and the wagon moved forward back toward the road. Edgar stood at his gate and watched her go, and for a long moment after the wagon had disappeared around the curve in the road, he stayed exactly where he was, his hands in his coat pockets, his fingers resting on the folded papers that were going to change his life. He did not ride into town to file them that day. The next morning he told himself he would go in the afternoon. In the afternoon he told himself there was no urgent deadline and he would go the following day. By the third day he had stopped telling himself anything specific and had simply put the papers on the kitchen table and walked around them as if they were a sleeping animal he did not want to disturb. He was not a man who examined his own emotions with any great care or frequency, but even he could not entirely escape the awareness that something had shifted in him. He found himself thinking about Louise Bishop at odd moments, about the way she had said everything I own, which is not very much, but it is all I have, about the way she had filled his rain barrel without being asked, about the directness of her gaze and the steadiness she carried herself with, the kind of steadiness that is not hardness but is something better, a deep quiet strength that has been earned rather than assumed. On the fourth day after her arrival, he saddled Buck and rode into Millhaven. He told himself he was going to file the papers. He did not file the papers. He rode past the land office without stopping and continued on to the main street and dismounted in front of the Millhaven General Store and went inside to pick up some supplies he did not urgently need. And while he was there he asked the storekeeper, an older man named Gibbs, whether a woman named Louise Bishop had come through recently looking for accommodation. Gibbs, who had known Edgar since he was a boy and possessed absolutely no ability to be subtle, raised his eyebrows and said, "Matter of fact, she has. She is staying at Mrs. Harrow's on the south end of town, second floor room." though I gather she is looking for work, so she may not be there long if she does not find something." Edgar thanked him, bought his unnecessary supplies, and spent 10 minutes standing on the board sidewalk outside trying to determine whether riding to the south end of town to call on a woman he had met 4 days ago at the side of a road was a reasonable thing to do or simply embarrassing. He settled on the former and then spent another 5 minutes reminding himself that his situation was not exactly promising. He was a man in the process of selling his failing ranch and leaving the territory entirely. He had nothing to offer anyone. He went anyway. Mrs. Harrow's was a neat white house with a small porch, and Louise Bishop was sitting on that porch when he arrived, a mending basket on her lap and a spool of thread in her hand. She looked up when he dismounted, and the expression on her face went through several things very quickly before settling into something that was carefully composed but not, he thought, displeased. "Mr. Talbot," she said. "Miss Bishop," he said. "I was in town for supplies. I thought I would see how you had settled." "That's kind of you." She set down the shirt she had been mending. "Sit down if you'd like." He sat in the other chair on the porch and hung his hat on his knee, and they talked for the better part of an hour. He told her more about the ranch, and this time, carefully and sideways, she began to ask questions about it that went deeper than polite interest. She asked about the water situation, whether the creek that ran along the north boundary still ran in dry summers, and whether the grazing land on the eastern section got good winter sun. They were knowledgeable questions, the questions of someone who understood ranch operations. "You said you grew up on a ranch in Colorado," Edgar said. "Did you work it?" "My father did," Louise said. "My mother died when I was 9. It was just my father and me and 2 ranch hands after that. I worked it as much as any of them." She looked out at the main street for a moment. "My father sold it when I was 23, had an offer he thought was fair, and he was tired. He moved into town and worked at the feed store until he passed last year. I'm sorry. We had good years," she said. "Long ones on the ranch. Those I don't regret." Edgar looked down at his hat. "What brought you to Wyoming, besides the plans that fell through with your cousin?" Louise was quiet for a moment, and he sensed that the question had touched something real, something she was deciding whether to answer with the full truth or a comfortable partial version of it. She chose the full truth. "After my father died, I was working as a seamstress in Rifle, Colorado. Good work, honest work, but I was inside all day with fabric and thread, and I could feel myself getting smaller. I grew up outdoors. I grew up knowing what the morning smells like before the rest of the world wakes up. I missed it. My cousin's letter felt like a door opening." She paused. "The door turned out to be painted on a wall, but I am still glad I walked toward it." Edgar was looking at her when she said that last sentence, and she was looking back at him, and the space between them on that small porch felt both very short and very significant at the same time. He rode home that evening feeling something he had not felt in a long time. Not happiness exactly, not yet. More like the possibility of happiness, which is its own kind of feeling and perhaps the more powerful one, because it still contains everything it could be rather than the smaller portion of what it actually is. The papers sat on the kitchen table when he walked inside. He picked them up, looked at them for a long moment, and then put them in the top drawer of the desk in his father's old study and closed the drawer. He was not done thinking yet. He needed more time to think. That was all. He went back to Millhaven 2 days later, and then again 2 days after that. Each time he brought a reason that was transparent enough to be almost amusing. Supplies once. A question about the road condition east of the county line once. A piece of mending his own shirt collar that needed a woman's skilled hand. Though he was embarrassed enough about that last one that he nearly turned around twice on the way. Louise took the shirt, looked at it, and looked at him with an expression that told him she knew perfectly well why he was really there, and mended the collar in 5 minutes while they drank coffee on Mrs. Harrow's porch, and handed it back to him warm from her hands. On the 5th visit, which was now more than 2 weeks after they had first met, He arrived to find Mrs. Harrow herself on the porch instead of Louise, and the older woman informed him that Miss Bishop had taken a job helping at the Millhaven Mercantile, stocking shelves and handling books in the morning hours, and that she would not be back until early afternoon. Edgar thanked Mrs. Harrow and went to the Mercantile. Louise was behind the counter, writing in a ledger with careful, precise handwriting. She looked up when he came in, and this time she did not bother to compose her expression before he could read it. She looked pleased to see him, straightforwardly and simply pleased, and he felt that like a hand pressed warm against his chest. "I hear you found work," he said. "3 mornings a week," she confirmed. "Mr. Gilly needed someone who could manage accounts, and he found out I could. It helps with Mrs. Harrow's rent." Edgar leaned against the counter. He had been thinking on the ride in about what he wanted to say to her, and he had not found a satisfactory arrangement of words, so he was going to have to improvise. He was not naturally a man of flowery speech. He was direct by nature, which sometimes worked against him and sometimes he hoped for him. "I want to ask you something," he said. Louise set down her pen and gave him her full attention. "There is a lot that needs doing at the ranch," he said. "The east fence line needs repair along 3 sections. The root cellar needs restocking before summer gets fully underway. The kitchen garden has been sitting empty for 2 years, and it ought to have something growing in it before the season runs too long. I have a horse that needs gentling before she's fit to ride." He stopped and looked at her. "I know that is a list of problems and not a particularly attractive picture, but I am also aware that you are a woman who knows ranch work, and who is spending her mornings doing account books in a mercantile when she would rather be outdoors. So I am asking whether you would come out and help me, as a paid hand, a fair wage." Louise was quiet for a moment. He could not entirely read her expression, and that was unusual. "How long?" she asked. "As long as you are willing," he said, "and as long as the work holds." Louise looked at him for several more seconds, and then she looked down at the ledger in front of her and straightened the pen in its holder and looked back up at him. "I will speak to Mr. Gilly about keeping my mornings here," she said, "and I will come to the ranch in the afternoons, but I want one thing understood before I agree." "What is that?" "I am not a woman who works for wages and also for other things unstated," she said, meeting his eyes steadily. "I need to know that what you are offering is exactly what you said it is. Work, a fair wage, nothing else with strings attached." It was a direct question asked with complete dignity, and it deserved a direct answer. "That is exactly what I am offering," Edgar said. "You have my word, and if at any point you feel otherwise, you tell me and you stop coming, and I will have failed to keep my word, which is not something I intend to do." Louise held his gaze for one more moment, measuring, and then nodded. "Then yes," she said, "I will come." She came the following afternoon, and the one after that, and the ones after that. The work between them was real from the beginning, which surprised Edgar slightly, though it should not have. He had said she was coming to work, and she came to work. She arrived each day on her bay horse, wearing canvas work trousers she had apparently acquired in town, and looking perfectly at ease in them, her hair braided and pinned. And she rolled up her sleeves and asked where she was needed, and then went and did the thing with the quiet competence of someone who had been doing ranch work since before she could fully reach the top of a fence post. The east fence line took them 4 afternoons to repair properly. They worked side by side, Edgar setting posts and stretching wire while Louise tamped soil around the bases and tested each section with her weight when it was done. She did not chatter while she worked, but she was not silent either. She talked when there was something worth saying, and the things she said were usually worth hearing. On the 3rd afternoon of fence work, while they were eating their midday meal sitting on the top rail with the wide expanse of the Talbot land spread out before them and the mountains blue and clear in the distance, Louise said, "This is good land." "It was," Edgar said. "It still is," she said. "It has not gone anywhere, the land. It has just been resting." He looked at her profile, the straight line of her nose and the particular way she held her jaw, and he said, "Do you think land can come back from being neglected?" She turned and looked at him. I think most things can come back if the right attention is paid to them at the right time. She was talking about the land. She might have been talking about other things. He was not entirely sure, and he found that uncertainty not uncomfortable but rather electric, the way the air feels before a lightning storm. Louise began to stay for supper on the days she came to the ranch. This was Edgar's doing initially. He would start something cooking in the mid-afternoon and she would smell it from wherever she was working. And by the time the light shifted toward evening, they were both inside, eating at the kitchen table, and it was the most natural thing in the world. She was a good cook, much better than he was, and she began taking over the supper preparation on the days she came while he finished up whatever outdoor work they had not completed. Coming inside to the smell of something proper cooking, and to find her moving around the kitchen with her sleeves still rolled up, and her braid loosening slightly from its pins at the end of the day, was an experience Edgar would carry in his memory for the rest of his life. They talked at supper the way people talk when they are getting to know each other at the best possible pace, not rushing, not retreating, just going forward steadily like a good horse at an easy walk. She told him about her childhood in Colorado, the ranch in Garfield County, where she had learned to ride before she could read. The winter when she was 12 and the snow came so hard and fast that they lost 14 head of cattle in 3 days, and her father had sat at the table with his head in his hands, and she had put her small hand on his shoulder without knowing what else to do. She told him about the small, sharp grief of growing up female in a world that had complicated feelings about what a woman who loved outdoor work and animals, and the smell of turned earth was supposed to do with those loves. She told him about the seamstress years in Rifle with a frankness that included both the pride she took in the work and the quiet suffocation she had felt. Edgar told her things in return. He told her about his father, a large, quiet man of great physical strength and very few words, who had built this ranch from scratch and poured 30 years of himself into it, and who Edgar had never once heard complain about any of it. He told her about his mother, who had loved books and made the best apple pie in Powder River County, and who had cried at every sunset over the mountains for 20 years because she found them that beautiful. He told her about the years after both his parents were gone, and how the silence of the house had become something with weight and texture, something he walked through every day like moving through standing water. He told her that he had signed papers to sell the ranch. He told her that last part on the 8th evening she came to supper, after the dishes were cleared, and they were sitting on the porch in the blue light of a warm Wyoming evening with coffee that had gone a little cold in the cups. And he told her because she had made some comment about what a shame it was the kitchen garden had been left so long, and how she would love to see it properly planted and producing. And the word she used, love, landed on him in a way that made him feel dishonest for not telling her the full truth of his situation. Louise was quiet for a long moment after he told her. Then she said, "The Harlan Company." "Yes, how do you know them?" "I have heard of them," she said carefully. "They buy land at low prices from people in difficult circumstances and then consolidate it into larger holdings, sell it on for considerably more." "I know," Edgar said. "The price was low. Have you filed the papers?" He looked at her. "No," another quiet. The evening insects had started in the grass beyond the porch. An owl somewhere in the cottonwoods along the creek made its soft rolling call. "What stopped you?" Louise asked. She was not asking to accuse him or to push him toward a particular answer. She asked with genuine curiosity, the way she asked most things, directly, and with respect for the complexity of the answer. Edgar looked out at the dark shape of the land, the barn, the fence lines. "I am not certain," he said. And then, because it was her and because the evening was that particular shade of blue that makes honesty easier, "that is not entirely true. I think what stopped me was that I had convinced myself this place was already gone, and then someone arrived who saw it differently than that, who saw it as something that was still here." Louise looked at him. He could feel her looking at him even though he was looking at the land. "Edgar," she said, It was the first time she had used his given name, and it sounded right in a way that made his heart take an irregular beat. "I know how that sounds," he said quickly. "I am not putting something on you that does not belong there. I am not saying you should stay or that anything is owed between us. I am only being honest about why the papers are still in a drawer instead of filed." "I know you are not putting anything on me," she said. "You are too careful a man for that." She paused. "I think what I want to say is that I am glad you didn't file them." They sat with that for a long time, and the owl called again, and the night settled fully around them, and neither of them moved to go inside or to say anything more, and it was one of the finest evenings of Edgar Talbot's life. Things between them deepened after that with the inevitability of something that has been slowly gathering force. It was not a sudden rush. It was a tide, which is more powerful than a rush in the end because it is constant and patient, and it covers everything with time. They planted the kitchen garden together in the last days of May, on their hands and knees in the turned earth in the early morning before the heat of the day came on, planting beans and squash and 2 rows of carrots, and a long bed of tomato seedlings that Edgar had driven into Millhaven to buy from the woman who grew them in her greenhouse each year. Louise planted with the same quiet thoroughness she brought to everything. She hummed while she worked, not a full tune, just a recurring phrase of something he could not identify, and the sound of it in the morning quiet of the garden became one of those small things a person stores up without meaning to. He reached for the same tomato seedling she reached for, and their hands met in the dirt, and neither of them pulled back immediately. They stayed like that for a moment, their hands overlapping in the dark soil, and he looked at her and she looked at him, and she had a smear of earth on her left cheekbone, and the morning light was laying itself across her face in a way that made him forget whatever sensible thing he had been thinking. "Louise," he said. "Yes," she said. Not "yes, what do you want?" Just "yes," like an answer to a question he had not yet managed to ask. He kissed her there in the kitchen garden, kneeling in the dirt with his hands still dark with soil, and her hat knocked slightly sideways by the angle of it, and it was awkward and imperfect and completely right. She kissed him back without hesitation and without performance, the way she did everything, honestly and fully and without reservation. When they pulled apart, she looked at him with an expression he had not seen on her before, softer than her usual steadiness, not unguarded exactly, but open in a different way, a way that told him something had been decided. "I need to say something to you," she said. "Say it," he told her. "I came to Wyoming without a plan," she said. "I came towards something that had already changed before I arrived, and I was not sure what I was going to do. I told myself I would figure it out. I am a practical woman, and I have figured things out before." She stopped and looked down at their joined hands for a moment, then back at him. "I am telling you this because I do not want you to think I am here because I have nowhere else to go. I have options. I could go to Ohio with Vera. I could go back to Colorado. I could stay in Millhaven and work for Mr. Gilly and build something small for myself." "I know you have options," Edgar said. "You are the most capable woman I have ever met." She looked at him. "I am telling you that I am here in this garden because I want to be, not because I have to be." He squeezed her hand. "I know that too," he said. "It matters more than you know that you say it." Louise took a breath and something in her settled, visibly, like a person putting down a weight they had been carrying without realizing it. "All right," she said. "Good." And then she reached up and straightened her hat and looked at the remaining tomato seedlings and said, "We had better finish this row before the morning gets away from us." He laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that comes from deep in the chest, and it surprised him because it had been a long time since he had laughed like that. Louise looked at him with that soft, open expression again, and then she laughed too, and the two of them planted the rest of the tomato row with light hearts and dirty hands, and the Wyoming morning coming on warm and clear all around them. The signed papers came out of the drawer that evening. Edgar put them in the fireplace and lit a match. He watched the Harlan Company contract curl and blacken and turn to ash, and he did not feel the loss he had expected. He felt instead a kind of clearing. the way the air feels after a hard rain, cleaner and cooler and more itself. He sent a letter to Curtis Feld the following morning informing him that he was withdrawing from the sale. Feld's reply came 2 weeks later and was, predictably, unhappy. There were veiled suggestions about legal consequences that had no actual legal basis, which was the kind of bluster Harlan Company representatives were apparently trained in. Edgar filed the letter in the same drawer the contract had come from and did not respond to it. He had a ranch to rebuild. What followed was the most intensely alive summer Edgar Talbot had experienced since he was a young man helping his father in the years of the ranch's best productivity. He hired 2 hands, brothers named Dell and Court Munoz, who were experienced, hardworking, and had no patience for laziness in themselves or anyone else. Louise met them on their first day and shook their hands and talked to them like equals, and Edgar watched the brothers exchange a glance that told him they had taken her measure and found it good. They rebuilt the east fence line completely, not just the 3 broken sections. They cleared the drainage channels along the south field that had been clogging for 3 years and letting good water run sideways instead of toward the root systems where it was needed. They repaired the barn roof with lumber Edgar bought in Millhaven, carrying it out on the wagon in 3 loads with Dell and Court and Louise all working alongside him. They dewormed and rebounded the remaining cattle herd, which was small but not beyond recovery, and Edgar began making inquiries about buying additional stock from a rancher he trusted in the next county. Louise continued her 3 mornings a week at the mercantile and spent the rest of her time at the ranch. It was Mrs. Harrow who, with the cheerful directness of a woman who has watched many things from her porch over the years, said to Louise one afternoon in July, "My dear, you ride out there every day and come back in the evening. It seems like you are putting a great deal of yourself into that ranch." "I suppose I am," Louise said. "And Mr. Talbot, Mrs. Harrow asked with a particular tone. Louise smiled without answering directly, which was all the answer Mrs. Harrow needed. The first time Edgar told Louise he loved her, it was not a planned moment. It was a Tuesday evening in late July. They had spent the afternoon sorting through the old tack room at the back of the barn, organizing and cleaning and throwing out what was beyond repair, and they had found, tucked behind a broken saddle tree in the corner, a small crate of his mother's things that must have been stored there years ago and forgotten. Books, mostly. A few letters in careful handwriting. A small portrait in a wooden frame of his parents in the early years of the ranch, both of them very young, standing in front of the original house that had been the smaller of the 2 structures on the property before his father had built the main house. Edgar had sat down on an overturned crate and looked at the portrait for a long time without speaking. Louise sat beside him and looked at it too. "They look happy," she said quietly. "They were," Edgar said, "most of the time. It was hard work and there were hard years, but they chose each other and they chose this place, and I never once doubted that they were glad of both choices." He ran his thumb across the edge of the frame. "I think that is the thing that has been missing for me these past years, not the cattle numbers or the fence condition, the choosing, having someone to choose things with." Louise was quiet beside him. He could feel the warmth of her shoulder against his. "I love you," he said. He said it looking at the portrait, and then he turned and looked at her. "I want you to know that with no obligation attached to it. I am not saying it to press you toward anything. I am saying it because it is true, and because I think you deserve to know true things." Louise looked at him with those steady dark eyes, and her expression was the fullest he had ever seen it, all the composure and the strength and the steadiness present in it, but also something new, something warm and unguarded that she was not trying to hide. "I love you too, Edgar," she said. "I have for a while. I was waiting to be sure you knew what you meant by it before I said it back." He took her hand in his and looked at her, and the weight of the past 2 years, the loss and the silence and the slow, grinding defeat of it all, felt very far away. Outside the barn, the summer evening was gold and long, and the kitchen garden they had planted together was growing abundantly, and the mountains held the last light in their snow-touched peaks, and everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. He asked her to marry him in August, on the porch after supper, with the fireflies just starting in the low grass beyond the fence and the evening star visible in the western sky. He had not bought a ring because he had not known what she would want and he did not want to presume, and he told her so, and she told him she did not need a ring, and that if he wanted to give her something as a token he could let her pick out the curtain fabric for the kitchen window because the current ones were genuinely terrible, and he laughed so hard at that answer that he had to put his forehead against her shoulder for a moment to recover. "Is that a yes?" he asked. "Yes, Edgar," she said. "That is a yes." They were married in September by the circuit minister who came through Millhaven twice a year, a broad-shouldered man named Reverend Cole who had a good voice and a kind manner. The ceremony took place at the ranch, on the flat ground in front of the house, with Dell and Court Munoz and Mr. Gibbs from the general store and Mrs. Harrow and Mr. Gilly from the mercantile all attending, and the kitchen garden green and heavy, with the end of the summers growing behind them. Louise wore a dress she had made herself over the preceding 3 weeks, a deep blue-gray wool blend that was simple and elegant and suited her exactly, and she had woven small dried wildflowers into her braided hair. Edgar wore his best suit, which was not very fancy but was clean and well-pressed, and he had polished his boots to a degree they had possibly never achieved before and likely would not again. He stood at the front and watched her walk toward him across the grass with the mountains behind her and the blue Wyoming sky above everything, and he thought that, whatever had brought him to the brink of selling this land and leaving, he would spend the rest of his life grateful that a wagon wheel had broken at exactly the right moment on exactly the right stretch of road. The Reverend said the words. Edgar and Louise said the words back. And when it was done and Reverend Cole said they were married, Louise looked at Edgar with an expression that contained everything she was, the strength and the directness and the humor and the deep quiet warmth of her, all of it turned toward him without reservation, and he felt that look reach right down to the foundation of him and hold. The celebration afterward was not elaborate, but it was warm and genuine. Mrs. Harrow had brought 2 pies. Mr. Gibbs had contributed a bottle of good whiskey. Dell and Court had been persuaded by Louise to bring their guitars, and it turned out both of them played well enough that by evening everyone present had danced at least once, including Mr. Gilly, who was 62 and moved with surprising agility. When the guests had gone and the last wagon had rolled back toward the road in the early moonlight, Edgar and Louise stood together on the porch of the ranch house that was now properly theirs together, and the evening was very still and very clear. "Happy?" he asked. "Enormously," she said, leaning against his side. I cannot think of a word large enough," he said. She turned and looked up at him. "Try." He looked at the land, the dark grass and the fence lines and the barn and the garden, and then at her. "Home," he said, "that is the word." Louise was quiet for a moment and then she nodded. "Yes," she said. "That is exactly the right word." The first autumn of their marriage was a working one, which suited them both. There was a great deal still to be rebuilt, and they threw themselves into it with the combined energy of 2 people who had both been working hard in isolation for too long, and who had now discovered the multiplying effect of working alongside someone who matched you. Edgar bought 12 additional head of cattle from the rancher in the next county in October, sturdy animals that integrated well with the existing small herd. He and Dell and Court drove them back over 2 days, camping one night on the trail, and when he came home dusty and tired from the drive, Louise had supper on the stove and the kitchen warm and the new curtain fabric she had picked out in Millhaven already hung on the window, a practical dark green that somehow made the whole kitchen look better, and he stood in the doorway for a moment, just taking in the fact that this was his life now. Louise had been busy herself during the 2 days he was gone. She had ridden into Millhaven and come back with a small package from the agricultural supply man, seeds for the following year's garden, an expanded selection, and she had sat at the kitchen table in the evenings and made careful plans for the spring planting in the journal she used for such things. She had also, with characteristic practicality, identified a problem with the root cellar drainage that he had missed and had spoken to Court about beginning the repair before the ground froze. "You hired Court to fix my root cellar while I was away," Edgar said, not displeased, just registering the full scope of her. "I hired Court to fix our root cellar," Louise corrected. "He has the right tool for it, which we do not. It makes more sense." He shook his head and kissed her, and she laughed against his mouth. Winter came hard that year, as Wyoming winters tend to do, blowing down from the north with the kind of sustained cold that makes the world go very quiet and very white and very serious. The ranch prepared. They had put up enough feed for the cattle and the horses. The wood was stacked to the eaves of the woodpile shelter. The root cellar was stocked and properly drained. The house was warm. Being snowbound with Louise, Edgar discovered, was an entirely different experience from being snowbound alone, which he had endured for the past 2 winters with a misery he had not fully acknowledged even to himself at the time. She read in the evenings, from the small collection of books she had brought with her, and from the ones they had found in the crate in the tack room, his mother's books, which she handled with a reverence that moved him deeply. She taught him a card game she had learned from a Ute woman who had traded regularly at the feed store in Rifle, and they played it most evenings after supper, sitting across the kitchen table from each other in the lamplight, and he lost most of the time because she was a more strategic thinker than he was, and she found his losing endearing rather than problematic, which said a great deal about who she was. They talked through those long evenings about everything and nothing. About what they wanted the ranch to be in 5 years and 10 years. About whether they ought to plant an orchard along the south-facing slope where the soil was deep and the sun was good. About the cattle market and what they were hearing from the ranchers in the region. About books and about the past and about the future. It was in January, during one of those evenings, that Louise told him she thought she was pregnant. She said it plainly, in the way she said most things, looking at him across the table with the card game between them and her hands folded around her coffee cup. She said it with that careful steadiness she always carried, but with something else underneath it that he recognized as the particular vulnerability of someone sharing something large. Edgar set down his cards. He looked at her. His first feeling was too big to name and too sudden to organize, a rush of something that was half exhilaration and half the deepest tenderness he had ever felt. He stood up from the table and came around to her side and crouched down beside her chair so that he was at her level, and he took her hands in his. "Louise," he said. "I know it is winter," she said. "It is not the most convenient timing." "There is no inconvenient timing for this," he said. "Not for us. Not here." She looked at him, and the careful steadiness began to give way to something softer and fuller, and her eyes were bright. "Are you happy?" she asked. "I am so happy," he said. "I am so happy I do not know where to put it." She laughed, and the sound of it in the warm kitchen with the winter howling outside was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. She wrote to Vera in Ohio with the news, and Vera's reply came 6 weeks later, full of joy and detailed questions, and the information that Vera herself had met a man in Cincinnati named Howard who worked at a law office, and whom she liked very much, which was its own good news. Louise read the letter twice at the kitchen table, and then folded it and held it for a moment with her eyes closed. And Edgar knew, without asking, that she was thinking about her father and wishing he were here to know. He put his hand on her shoulder, and she put her hand over his, and they stayed like that for a moment. Spring came like mercy after the long winter, sudden and green, and full of sound after months of white silence. The creek along the north boundary ran high and clear with snowmelt. The garden beds thawed, and Louise was out in them as soon as the ground was workable, planning and planting with the expanded seed selection she had ordered. And Edgar worked alongside her on the weekends and evenings, while Dell and Court handled the stock and the fence work that came with the thaw. Louise was in her 5th month of pregnancy by the time the spring planting was done, and she worked steadily through it, adjusting as she needed to but not stopping, which was entirely in character, and which Edgar accepted without argument because he had known from the beginning that she was not a woman who needed to be managed or protected from her own capable self. He did, however, make sure she had good help. He arranged with Mrs. Harrow, who had a gift for practical care, to come out to the ranch 2 days a week as the summer progressed. Mrs. Harrow was delighted to come and brought with her a wealth of practical knowledge about pregnancy and childbirth that made Edgar, who knew a great deal about calving and very little about the human equivalent, feel somewhat more prepared. The summer was good. The cattle herd was building toward something sustainable. The garden was producing abundantly. The orchard they had agreed on, 12 young apple trees and 6 pear trees ordered from a nursery in Cheyenne, arrived in June and were planted with ceremony and careful attention along the south-facing slope, small and green and promising. In the evenings, sitting on the porch, Edgar sometimes caught himself thinking about the morning he had signed those papers, the complete certainty he had felt that there was nothing left here worth staying for. He tried to understand how he had come to that place, how a person could look at land like this and a life like this and see only emptiness. He thought it was a kind of grief that had settled over everything: his father's death, his mother's before that, the slow failure of the ranch, all of it compounding until the weight of it had changed the way he saw things, made the colors dim. Louise had changed the way he saw things. Not by performing anything or by being anything other than exactly who she was. Simply by being here, by seeing the land as still alive and still worth caring for, by filling the rain barrel without being asked, by planting the garden and mending the fence and sitting on the porch in the blue evenings, and saying yes to him in the kitchen garden with her hands in the dirt. He told her some of this one evening in August, sitting on the porch with the warm dark around them and the mountains black against the stars. She listened without interrupting, which was one of her great gifts. When he finished, she said, "I think sometimes we need someone to see what we have stopped being able to see for ourselves, not because we are weak, just because grief and exhaustion do something to the eyes. They change the angle of things." "You saw it," he said. "I saw it," she agreed. "But it was here the whole time. You kept it here even when you were ready to walk away from it. You didn't actually go." He thought about that. She was right in a way he had not fully considered. He had signed the papers and not filed them. He had made the plan and not completed it. Some part of him had hesitated. "Maybe I was waiting," he said. Louise looked at him in the dark. "Maybe you were," she said. He reached over and took her hand, and they sat like that until the night grew cool enough to go inside. Their son was born on a bright October morning in 1884, delivered by Dr. Whitfield, who had ridden out from Millhaven in the early hours when it became clear the time was coming. Edgar stood outside the bedroom door for what felt like half of his natural life, useful to no one, listening to sounds that terrified him in their intensity, and then, after what Dr. Whitfield later told him was actually a fairly uncomplicated labor for a first birth, hearing a different sound entirely. The sound of a baby crying. He went very still when he heard it. His hands were shaking. He had not realized they were shaking. Mrs. Harrow came out and found him leaning against the wall with his hat pressed to his chest, and told him it was a boy and that Louise was tired but well, and that he could go in. The room was quiet when he went in, the early morning light coming through the green curtains Louise had chosen, and Louise was in the bed with her hair loose and her face tired but her eyes clear and open, and there was a wrapped bundle in her arms that was making small, uncertain sounds. Edgar sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his wife and his son, and could not speak for a moment. "He has your ears," Louise said, and her voice was rough with exhaustion but warm with something vast. "Poor child," Edgar managed. Louise laughed softly. She shifted the bundle and held it toward him, and Edgar took his son into his arms for the first time with the careful, terrified reverence of a man holding something more important than anything he has ever held before. The baby had wrinkled hands and a furrowed forehead and eyes that were not yet quite focused, and Edgar looked at him and felt something he had no word for, a love that was entirely different from any other love he knew, instantaneous and absolute and already permanent. "What shall we call him?" Louise asked. They had discussed names, several, without fully settling. Edgar looked at the baby in his arms and said, "William, for my father if you are willing." Louise looked at him with soft eyes. "I think that is right," she said. William James Talbot, named for Edgar's father and with Louise's father's name in the middle, became the loudest and most present thing on the Talbot ranch in short order. He was a strong baby who made his wants known with impressive volume, and who, in the first months, seemed to regard sleep as a largely optional activity. Edgar and Louise navigated the exhaustion of new parenthood with the same practical partnership they had brought to everything else, trading off night wakings, working out systems, being patient with each other's rougher edges when sleep deprivation made those edges sharper. Mrs. Harrow came out more frequently in the early weeks and was invaluable in ways that Edgar would be grateful for long after. Louise recovered from the birth with the same matter-of-fact resilience she brought to recovering from everything, and by the time William was 2 months old she was back in the kitchen garden in the mornings. While William slept in the basket she kept near the garden gate, close enough to hear and reach in moments. The ranch continued to grow. By the following spring, Edgar had nearly doubled the cattle herd and was beginning to see the operation stabilize in a way it had not in years. Dell and Court Munoz were full-time hands now, reliable and good. They had the rhythm of the place in their bones. Edgar trusted them completely. The orchard was growing. Small and still young, the apple and pear trees were putting out real growth now, and Louise kept careful notes on each tree's progress in her journal, which had expanded to 3 volumes and constituted the most thorough record of the Talbot Ranch's revival that existed anywhere. William learned to walk in the spring of 1885 and applied himself to the activity with a determination that reminded Edgar of Louise and a particular brand of fearlessness that he supposed came from both of them. He walked into the furniture, into the fence posts, into the legs of the horses in the paddock, and got up each time with an expression of interest rather than distress and tried again immediately. Louise watched him from the porch step one afternoon, this small, sturdy person who was half of her and half of Edgar, and something in her expression was so full and so complete that Edgar, coming up behind her, stopped and just looked at her for a moment before she heard him. He bent and kissed the top of her head and she leaned back against him, and they watched their son walk purposefully toward the chicken coop with his hands out for balance. "I have been thinking," Louise said. "That is never a quiet statement from you," Edgar said. "What are you thinking about?" "The Henderson place," she said. "East of our boundary, 200 acres. Henderson is moving to Laramie to be near his daughter. He mentioned to Court last week that he might be open to offers." Edgar was quiet for a moment, considering. 200 acres adjacent to the eastern boundary, a creek that ran through it that would link to the drainage system they had spent 2 years improving. "That would make us a real operation," he said. "That is what I was thinking," Louise said. "If the spring cattle sales go as I am expecting them to, based on the numbers, we have enough set aside for a fair offer." Edgar put his chin on the top of her head and thought about it. 2 years ago he had been ready to give away what he had. Now they were talking about expanding it. "Write up the numbers," he said. "Let me see them." She had the numbers written up that evening, precise and clear in her careful handwriting, and they went over them together at the kitchen table after William was in bed, moving figures around the page, debating projections, questioning assumptions. It was one of his favorite kinds of evenings. 2 people who trusted each other's minds working through something real together. They made an offer on the Henderson land in June. Henderson accepted it. The deed for the expanded Talbot Ranch was signed on a Tuesday morning at the land office in Millhaven, the same land office Edgar had ridden past without stopping more than 2 years ago, the signed Harlan Company papers in his coat pocket. He stood at the counter and put his name on a very different kind of document this time, and felt the full weight of the contrast. Louise was beside him when he signed, William on her hip playing with the fringe of her coat, and she put her own hand over his on the pen just for a moment before he lifted it from the page. Not directing him, just there with him, a shared moment at a shared decision. Walking out of the land office into the bright Millhaven morning, Edgar stopped on the board sidewalk and turned to look at his wife and his son, and the wide main street with the mountains rising blue beyond the rooftops. "I almost sold this," he said. Not to Louise specifically, just to the morning, to himself. The weight of it was something he revisited sometimes, not with regret exactly, but with a kind of sustained gratitude that needed occasional acknowledging. Louise looked at him. "But you didn't," she said. "A wheel broke at the right time," he said. She shook her head, a slight smile on her face. "A wheel broke," she said, "and then you came." They walked back to where Buck was hitched, and the bay horse, Louise's horse, was hitched beside him. They had long since named the bay Clem, a name William had contributed in his particular phonetic fashion, and which had stuck because nothing else they tried afterward sounded right. Edgar lifted William up to ride in front of him on Buck's broad back, which was William's greatest joy in life at 14 months, and Louise swung up onto Clem with the ease she had always had on horseback, and they rode home to the ranch together. The autumn of that year brought the apple tree's first real fruit, still young trees and still small apples, but real ones, firm and tart and unmistakably there. Louise picked them one September afternoon with William toddling among the grass beneath the trees, examining windfalls with intense concentration, and brought a basket of them inside to the kitchen. She made apple butter, the first batch from the Talbot orchard, and put it up in jars that sat in a row on the kitchen shelf with their lids sealed and their contents glowing amber in the afternoon light, and the kitchen smelled of apples and spice, and the particular sweetness of good things made from scratch. Edgar came in from the fields and stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at the jars on the shelf and at Louise at the stove and William sitting on the braided rug playing with the wooden horse that Court had carved him, and he could not have said precisely what it was he felt except that it was enormous and warm and absolutely real. "My mother made apple butter," he said. Louise turned. "I know," she said gently. "You told me once. I thought it was time to have it in this kitchen again." He stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then he came inside and found a spoon and tasted the butter from the pot, and it was good, genuinely good, and Louise was watching him with her steady dark eyes. "It's very good," he said. "I know," she said, without conceit but with complete honesty, and he laughed. William reached for the spoon and was given a small taste and responded with the kind of all-body enthusiasm only very small children can produce, and both his parents laughed at him, and the kitchen was warm and full of light. 3 years after that September, in the autumn of 1888, their second child arrived. A girl this time, born at the start of October with dark hair exactly the color of Louise's, and a temperament from the very beginning that was more like Edgar's quiet steadiness than William's energetic approach to everything. They named her Clara Jane, and she arrived into a ranch that was full and running and well, and into a family that had room for her in every sense of the word. William, now 4, regarded his sister with a complex mixture of fascination and mild suspicion that resolved itself within a week into protective devotion when he discovered that she gripped his offered finger with a surprising firmness. "She holds on," he told his father with considerable respect. "She is a Talbot woman," Edgar said. "She will hold on." The ranch in 1888 was a different thing from what it had been in 1883, when Edgar had stood in the dusty kitchen with papers in his coat pocket and nothing on the horizon but the decision to leave. The herd was strong and well managed. The Henderson land was fully integrated into the operation, and the expanded boundary made the water management on the eastern fields dramatically better. The orchard was in its 5th year and producing real harvests. The root cellar was always well stocked. The barn had a new south addition that Dell and Court had helped build the previous summer. The kitchen garden ran all 3 growing seasons, with succession planting that Louise had organized and managed with the same careful thoroughness she brought to the account books. Del Munoz had married a woman named Amara from Millhaven 2 years ago and had a son of his own now. Court was still unmarried, but had a patient way with William and Clara that made him essential at Christmas and on the children's birthdays. Mrs. Harrow had passed away the previous winter, peacefully in her sleep at the age of 74, and Edgar and Louise had both gone to her small service in Millhaven and felt the loss of her keenly, because she had been part of the early story of them in a way that mattered. Vera, Louise's cousin, had married her Howard in Cincinnati and written with the news of a baby daughter of their own, a correspondence that Louise maintained with faithful regularity, and which was a source of genuine warmth and connection across the long distance. One November evening of that year, with Clara 3 weeks old and sleeping in the wooden cradle Edgar had built over the course of 6 September evenings with particular care, and William long since in bed, Edgar and Louise sat together by the fire in the main room. The fire was good and hot and the room was warm, and outside the first serious cold of the season was settling over the land. Louise had Clara's tiny socks in her hands, checking the seams. Edgar had a land survey map spread on his knee that he was studying in connection with a question about the boundary fence on the north side of the Henderson property, but he was not really looking at it. He was looking at his wife. She sensed it after a moment the way she always did, with a small awareness that was not vanity but simply attentiveness, and she looked up from the socks. "What?" she said with the particular directness that she had never lost through any of it. "Nothing," he said. And then, because that was not entirely true and because he had never been in the habit of incomplete truths with her, he said, "I was thinking about the road." She tilted her head slightly. "The day your wheel broke," he said. "I was riding past the gate with the Harlan papers in my pocket, ready to file them and be done with all of this. And then your wheel broke, and I heard you, and I went." Louise set down the socks. She looked at him steadily, and I was thinking that if that wheel had held," he said, "if you had made it past that stretch of road without trouble, if I had been 5 minutes earlier coming out of the barn," he stopped. "I would have ridden into town, I would have filed those papers, I would have left Wyoming within the month." Louise was quiet. The fire crackled. Clara made a small sound in the cradle and settled again. "But you didn't file them," Louise said, "even after. You had days to go back and file them and you didn't." "No," he said, "I didn't." "Then maybe the wheel breaking was just a wheel breaking," she said, "and the rest of it was you." Edgar looked at her. The firelight was warm on her face and her eyes were steady and full, and the cradle was between them and the map was forgotten on his knee and the land outside was their land. He thought about that, about what she had said, that the choosing in the end had been his. She was probably right. She usually was. But he also knew that he needed the wheel to break, needed that particular voice in that particular moment on that particular road to understand what he still had the ability to choose. He folded up the map and set it aside. "Louise," he said. "Edgar," she said. "Thank you," he said, "for stopping on this road." She looked at him with everything she was, all the strength and the steadiness and the deep, steady love of her, and she said, "Thank you for coming to the fence when you heard the wheel break. Most people would have looked out the window and decided it was not their concern." "It was my road," he said. "It was," she agreed. "And you came." He moved from his chair to the settee beside her, and she leaned against him, and they sat together watching the fire, while their daughter slept between them in the cradle, and their son slept in the room down the hall, and the ranch lay quiet and good outside in the winter dark. There was a simplicity to the life they had built that was, Edgar knew, its own kind of wealth, not a simple life in the sense of an easy one. The ranch was hard work, honest and relentless and seasonal, and Wyoming was not a forgiving landscape for people who were not paying attention, but simple in the sense of being made from things that were real: land and work and animals and seasons. Coffee in the morning and supper in the evening, and a fire in winter and a garden in summer, and the sound of children and the weight of a good woman's hand in his. He had not known, on the morning he signed those papers, that this was what he was giving away. That was the cruelty of grief. It made absence seem like the only reality and presence seem like something that had already ended. But it had not ended. It had been waiting for his hands to come back to it and for her hands to join his. Spring came again, as it always did in Wyoming, in the slow and then sudden way of northern springs, where the world is white and brown and then almost without transition is green. William turned 5 in March and received from court a foal's halter and the promise that he would be allowed to help with the new foal's gentling, which occupied his imagination for weeks beforehand and his reality fully when the foal arrived in April. A filly with a dish face and a bold eye that William immediately named Penny because of the reddish color of her coat. Louise watched her son in the paddock with the young horse one April afternoon, patient and careful in a way that was remarkable for a 5-year-old, moving slowly and letting the filly come to him rather than chasing her. And she said to Edgar, standing beside her at the paddock rail, "He has a gift for this." "He learned from the best," Edgar said, which made Louise shake her head slightly in the way she did when she was pleased but did not want to perform the pleasure. Clara, from her blanket on the grass near the fence, was watching everything with the focused gaze she had already developed and which suggested she was taking notes for future reference. The years that followed were years of building, deepening, adding. The ranch grew in managed and sustainable ways. Edgar and Louise made decisions together at the kitchen table with the account books between them, arguing occasionally, which was not a problem but a sign of two people who both had minds and used them, and always arriving somewhere better than either of them would have reached alone. Their third child came in 1891, another boy, named Thomas, after no one specific, just because the name felt right to both of them, and the right name for a person is its own sufficient reason. Thomas arrived with the force of personality already established, louder than William had been and more immediately opinionated, and Clara regarded him from the beginning with a combination of amusement and resignation that would characterize their sibling relationship for decades. William, 7, was now a serious and capable presence on the ranch, allowed to help with real tasks under supervision, and he took this responsibility with a gravity that made both his parents privately proud and occasionally amused. He was a child who wanted to do things correctly, to understand the reason for each step, and he asked questions with a persistence that Edgar recognized as something that had come from his mother. The Talbot Ranch, by the early 1890s, was one of the more respected operations in Powder River County. Not the largest by any means, but well managed and known for good stock and fair dealing. Edgar's reputation in the region had grown over the years in the way that honest work builds reputation, slowly and solidly. Louise's contribution to that reputation was not invisible to those who knew the ranch. The ranchers and merchants and neighbors who had watched over the years as she kept accounts and managed the garden, and helped with the stock and made decisions alongside her husband, with the authority of someone who had earned her place in every square foot of the operation. There were those, it should be said, who found this arrangement unusual, or who expressed the opinion that a woman of Louise's capability was perhaps doing things that went beyond what was conventional for a ranch wife in Wyoming in the 1880s and 1890s. These opinions were expressed with varying degrees of tact and were received by Louise with the same composed directness she had always brought to things that required composure and directness. She was not a woman who spent energy being angry about the limits other people imagined for her. She simply continued doing what she was doing and let the work speak for the space she occupied. Edgar, for his part, had never thought of it as unusual. She was his partner in the full sense of the word. Everything the ranch had become was as much hers as his, and he said so plainly to anyone who raised the subject, which tended to end the conversation. By the time Thomas was walking, and the orchard was producing enough fruit for Louise to make apple butter to sell through the Millhaven Mercantile, in addition to stocking their own shelves, and William was helping with real fence work on summer mornings, the Talbot Ranch felt complete in a way that had nothing to do with size or profit, and everything to do with the particular rightness of a life that has been built with intention and love. One evening in the autumn of 1892, Edgar found Louise sitting on the porch after supper with the 3 children in various states of tiredness around her. Thomas asleep against her side. Clara reading with the determined concentration she brought to everything. William watching the last of the sunset with an expression of private thought. The mountains were doing what they always did at that hour, holding the last of the light in their heights while the valley went dark below, and the air smelled of apple harvest from the orchard and the particular dry grass smell of late Wyoming autumn. Edgar came out and sat beside his wife, and she shifted Thomas's sleeping weight slightly to make room, and he settled into the familiar shape of the evening, this porch, this sky, this family. "You know," he said quietly, not wanting to disturb Thomas or pull Clara from her book or William from his thoughts. "What?" Louise said softly. "I think about that morning often," he said, "when I was going to leave, and I always arrive at the same thought." She looked at him. "What thought?" "That I was not leaving because I wanted to go," he said. "I was leaving because I did not know how to stay. There is a difference, and you taught me the difference, not by instruction. Just by being here and being yourself, and making this place feel like something worth staying in." Louise held his gaze for a long moment in the quiet autumn evening, with their children around them and the mountains going dark in the distance, and the orchard they had planted together thick with the last of the season's fruit. "You already knew how to stay," she said. "The papers were in your pocket for weeks." He smiled. "The papers were in my pocket for weeks," he agreed. She took his hand on the armrest between them and laced her fingers through his, in the unhurried way of people who have been reaching for each other's hands long enough that the gesture is completely natural. Clara looked up from her book long enough to see her parents sitting together in the fading light and then looked back at her page. William turned from the mountains to glance at them and then turned back. Thomas slept on undisturbed. The porch held them all. The sun finished its descent, and the stars came out one by one over the Wyoming dark, and the Talbot Ranch lay quiet and good under them. The cattle settled, the horses in the barn, the garden done for the season and already planned for the next, the orchard trees standing their patient rows, the fence lines solid and maintained, the house warm and lit and full of everything that a man who had once been ready to walk away from all of it had chosen instead to stay and build. Edgar Talbot had planned to sell the ranch and leave. And then Louise Bishop had arrived on a broken wheel on a summer road, and had filled his rain barrel without being asked, and had looked at his neglected land with eyes that saw what it still was rather than what it had stopped being, and had come to work in the afternoons and stayed for supper, and planted his garden and mended his fence, and told him plainly that she loved him. And he had burned the papers in the fireplace, and never once in all the years that followed thought about the ashes. The wind came off the mountains that night the way it had every night for as long as Edgar could remember, crossing the wide grass and lifting slightly at the ranch house porch, carrying with it the smell of the high country, cold and clean and wild, and he breathed it in the way he always did, with his wife's hand in his and his children around him and his land spread wide and dark in every direction, and felt the full and absolute weight of a life that had come true. Not the life he had planned. Better than that. The life he had not known enough to plan for, that had arrived on a broken wheel and a summer morning, and changed every single thing, exactly as it was supposed to.